Hey, what's up, friends? Grant Baldwin here. Welcome back to the Speak Aloud podcast. So good to have you here with us today. Hey, I'm excited for our conversation with my friend Eva Daniel, who's a speaker coach extraordinaire and is going to enlighten us on all things creating, preparing for a talk. So, Eva, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right. First of all, why don't you give us a little bit of context and kind of just background on who are you, your kind of experience in the world of speaking, and kind of how you work with speakers.
Yeah, so for the last year and a half, I have been working the Speak Shop. So I'm a public speaking coach and consultant. I help both CEOs who are becoming more outward facing and then work with professional speakers, helping them both develop their content, figuring out what they're going to say, how they're going to say it, layering stories and humor and thought leadership, all of those things, as well as the delivery side and making sure that they nail their delivery. And before that, I was Dave Ramsey's speechwriter, worked with him and his team of speakers. And then before that, I have a deep background, almost 15 years in radio. And first professional love, loved radio, thought that I'd be in radio forever. And then as it changed and evolved into podcasting, got into podcasting, and then decided along the way that the speaking side looked really fun. And so started digging in and helping people on their content and do some public speaking myself and workshops and just love the communications industry.
That's awesome. Very cool. My dad actually was a radio DJ, I guess is what they used to call it, or maybe still call it. Like as I was growing up, he worked at a country station where we were from in Missouri. And so he did the morning show. And yeah, I mean, back in the 80s, early 90s, like that was the thing. And so it was a big deal for him. So I know like when I started getting into podcasting about a decade ago or so, we were kind of like, hey, this is the modern form of radio in some way. So here we are both today. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about this. Let's say that for a speaker who's watching, listening to this, going like, okay, I'm working on a talk, or I've got an idea for a talk, and let's just start from the beginning where I'm staring at a blank screen. I've got all these ideas, these things that I could talk about, and I'm just trying to figure out how do I go from like a blank screen to a polished presentation? Like, what kind of formula process do you typically walk people through to get to that presentation?
Well, I always tell people when you are first asked to give a speech or you know one's coming up, the biggest mistake that I repeatedly see speakers make is procrastination, just waiting too long to actually start developing the content and too long to practice the delivery. Instead of actually working on it, we start worrying about it or thinking about it, but we're not actually doing anything productive. So, one of the best things you can do is to just start a simple brainstorm, whether that is I have clients that do brainstorms on sticky notes, some that use Jamboard or whiteboards or just a Google Doc or a Word document. But I think that you need a great speech, often needs several brainstorms where when you think about that topic, you think about that thing you're being asked to speak about, you just brain dump everything on that. And, if whatever comes to mind. So maybe you think, oh, that new lyric in that Taylor Swift album, and oh, that experience that happened in 2008, and oh, when my boss said this, and oh, I read this thing in a book. Just dump all of those things on paper because you've got to get those things out of your head onto something you can start actually working around with. So, first step is simply just brainstorming your content and figuring out what is it that's in your head that needs to get out. And no matter if you use it or not. Now, a lot of those things you brainstorm are not going to fit in your keynote,
Right.
but just having that ability to go, instead of worrying about this or procrastinating, I'm going to just get all of these things out onto paper.
Now, I think that it's also important to note just kind of the context of obviously what the presentation would be in this hypothetical situation, because in some situations, you're giving like one presentation, one talk, and it's just kind of a one and done. I'm giving a toast at a wedding type of thing. It's very, very different than I am a speaker, and this is a new keynote that I'm developing, and I'm planning on giving this, dozens, if not hundreds of times over the course of the next couple of years. And so, how do you kind of think about like when you're creating a speech where it's like it's finished versus it's kind of a work in progress? Because I think that for speakers who are doing this full time or doing this pretty regularly, it's not like a misconception that you and I both understand is people aren't just giving like one speech and then start from scratch and one speech and start from scratch. It's oftentimes it's like they're giving the same speech over and over and over, and they're making like subtle tweaks and adjustments to it as they go. So if you're depending on kind of the context of how you're working on it, does that change how you would be approaching any given talk, knowing that especially if it's one that you're giving over and over and over, that it's never quite finished. It's always kind of a work in progress.
Yeah. So, a couple of things of what you said. One, I believe that every speaker should consider having 4 keynotes that they can give again and again. So, you've developed up your signature talk. You've developed up a talk that's going to work well in the business setting. You've developed a deep dive into a thought leadership topic. And then also, you've just given one like, I think if you're a professional speaker, you should consider creating a new keynote every year, at least one that can freshen up your brand, give you new enthusiasm for speaking. Sometimes, especially if you've been a keynote speaker for a while, you might have delivered that speech, your signature speech, hundreds of times, and you yourself are kind of bored of delivering it. So I think always having something fresh that you're developing out. But like you said, there's always this thing of iterating and developing and tweaking your content. But I think ideally, you're going to have a base of, say, 70 to 80% that really can stay the same from speaking engagement to speaking engagement to speaking engagement. But then, depending on the audience, depending on what's going on in your life, swapping out some of those stories or humor lines or little pieces to liven and freshen it up, and to make sure that you're tailoring your content to the audience. Because obviously, you and I would both agree, one of the biggest misses is speakers who get to the event and they're speaking to a crowd that doesn't feel like it's a mismatch between their message and the audience, because maybe they haven't done that work to figure out, who am I speaking to? What do they already know about the topic? What else can I add to it? But ideally, I think it's both. You have a base that you can use, but then you are looking at ways of, what are some more ways that I can like level up my storytelling here? Or how could I make my open or my close just a little bit sharper? Or what is a cultural thing that's happening that I really could just add a quick one-liner in? Or even, I always like to say, I always encourage my clients to have planned spontaneity. So
Yeah.
sections within their talk that they know that they're going to just kind of be spontaneous, the flow of whatever's happening at the conference, in the room, in the news, that they can just have pinpointed spots they've already pre-thought through, that, wow, if something comes to me, I'm going to riff and I'm going to have enough time and space in my talk. Because otherwise, you can run the risk of, just once you've given the same story, the same keynote again and again, you yourself can become bored of the content. So, one of the things, especially if you're speaking a lot, is just make sure that you're excited about what you're presenting and making sure that you're incorporating some of those new elements in.
Now, I've heard different ways of approaching this. Like, I know some speakers that would, like you kind of suggested there, maybe work on a talk from scratch, and I'm tossing everything else out and I'm doing something completely fresh. Or it could be the type of thing, like I've heard comedians that will, I'm going to take 20% of this and cut it out, and I'm going to put in a new 20%. So I got 80% that I know that works and 20% that is untested. And then, maybe over the course of another 6 months, maybe take out another 20%. And so it's kind of more of an iterative process of, I'm kind of taking out stuff that I know works and kind of subbing in. So it's never like completely fresh, because kind of the danger or the risk is, obviously, if you're giving a presentation for the first time, like, you're making an educated guess. Like, I think this is funny. I think this will make sense. I think this will resonate, but you just don't know until you get up in front of that audience. Now, obviously, like, the more you do it, the more you have a pretty good sense. Like, I'm pretty confident this is going to work, but you don't necessarily know until you get out there. So do you typically recommend that, like, speakers just start from scratch, whether you've given a presentation hundreds of times and put it away? Or is there anything that people can do to, I have this signature story, I just know the stories work, and I've told this 100 times and I know it kills every time? Any way to make it fresh for the speaker? Because I'm with you that that it's the first time the audience has heard it, but for a speaker, they've told it hundreds of times, and it just kind of gets boring and monotonous and tedious, versus giving something that they haven't presented on before. So how do you kind of think about that right balance there?
Well, I think the one thing that can be really helpful when you're looking at your speech or your speeches is to think of it as the playlist that you're presenting. So if you think about any of your favorite, I mean, we live here in Nashville. So when you think of any of your favorite musicians that are on tour, there's this part of you, it's like you want to hear their new album, but you also want to hear some of their greatest hits. And
Mm.
I think that applies really well to the speaking world as well. Test out a new story, maybe a new open or a close for a keynote you've given a lot. Testing new things. Sometimes I think it can be good to just, start afresh and just develop something new. But I think there's a lot to be said of just rearranging an old playlist in a new
Yeah.
way, or maybe what can work really well for an opening of a talk can work really well at a close, or a close could be a great open. Or sometimes that story that you have, the 27-minute mark, well, maybe it's time to rotate that up and try it as the opening of your talk, or just kind of moving the pieces around. One of the biggest mistakes I see people make is, we naturally, when we're writing out our speech. And some people, fully write out word for word. I have other clients that go up with 6 bullet points. But to whatever level you write out, what I see happen a lot is people will just put their things down in an order, but they didn't actually really think through, why are these the order of my points? Like, let's even just say you have 5 steps to creating a great culture for your team. Maybe that's kind of the base of your keynote. Well, are the 5 steps arranged? Why did you arrange them that way? Just make sure that they are arranged in a way that would make sense. Like, are they building from smallest to biggest, or biggest to smallest, or are you naturally going from big to small? But having a plan in the order for your content instead of just like smacking it down, like that's the way to deliver it. I would say actually that's one of the biggest things I find myself doing for professional speakers is rearranging the pieces of their speech. They have all the pieces that are there, but it's not necessarily arranged in the most engaging or meaningful way for the audience, or maybe all their serious content is in one chunk and then it's all lighthearted instead of having a natural flow and a rhythm throughout their keynote presentation. So a lot of times it's just thinking of your speech as a playlist. Maybe you have, it's like your open and your close. Well, that's a couple pieces. And maybe you have 3 or 4 points and you're solving this problem. Maybe your speech has, let's just say 6 to 10 pieces. And sometimes it's just looking at it with fresh eyes and asking, have I arranged this in a way that is logical, makes sense for the audience, is fun and engaging for me to give? A lot of times, even a good way to determine that is as you're giving a speech, if you feel like you kind of hit like a slow or a dead pocket in your speech, like as you're speaking, just ask, well, why? Does that section need something? Maybe it does need a little more story or humor, or maybe it's just in the wrong spot in your speech, or maybe it shouldn't be in your speech at all and you should cut it. But so just kind of having the evaluation after you've spoken to go, okay, what's working, what's not working, how can I level it up? So it's both, as you mentioned, iterating, making your speech better, making it be more engaging for you to deliver, but also for your audience. So I believe that every speech is alive and breathing and a work in progress. And so we're just always making sure that like is it in the best order, and do I enjoy giving it the way that it is? And is the audience responding well to it in the way that I would envision them to be responding? So I often say, if you are trying that new story, if you are trying that new joke and it doesn't land, well, instead of just scrapping and say, well, I'm never doing that again, kind of analyzing a little bit, like, okay, well, was it the crowd? Was it my delivery of it? Do I just not quite have it sharpened? Try it again. But, if 2 or 3 times you've tried it and it's still not working, maybe that's an indicator that you're not as funny as you think you are,
Yeah.
or the story's not landing as well. Maybe you do need to cut it. But instead of just scrapping something, make sure that you give it a little bit of a look to go, well, why isn't this not working? And just start analyzing your own content and your delivery a little bit more.
All right, you said several things there that I want to touch on. One, let's kind of go back to when you're kind of putting together a presentation, especially when you're early in your speaking career. And again, let's kind of assume that you're wanting to do this full time to whatever degree that may look like for you, and you're just trying to figure out like what kind of speaker and presenter am I? Am I more of a serious speaker? Am I more of a funny speaker? Am I more of a data speaker? Am I more of a story speaker? And I think that the default is oftentimes we kind of look for the path of least resistance, and we see other speakers. We're like, oh, I see it work for them, therefore I should copy that or emulate that in some way, intentionally or unintentionally. So how does a speaker kind of determine how they should present, and how do they feel comfortable in their own skin on stage?
So that's such a great question. And that's one of the things I actually love about your book and this podcast is you help people figure out a lot of what are your goals? Like, what are your goals for speaking beyond even just like what kind of speaker am I going to be? But I do think it's really important to know, what are your goals with speaking? And a mistake I made, earlier in my career was I sort of assumed that everybody's goal was the same, which was to make a lot of money speaking. Like, that's just what I thought the goal was for most people. And then I realized really quickly, for a lot of people, it's just to grow their business. They don't necessarily care if they're paid to speak at all, if it's going to grow their business. And other people, it's just because maybe they're older in their career and they want to give back. And to them, it's really about the mission and sharing their message. And not that you can't have more than one goal, obviously, for your speaking. But I think knowing your goal is a really big piece. And then as far as finding your voice, I personally, and maybe you have found something different, but I have personally not found any shortcut to just getting a lot of practice, a
Yeah.
lot of reps in front of live audiences. And, getting reps and more reps, those are the things that help you find your voice. Posting publicly online, whether that's video clips, whether that's written content, whether that's, blogs or articles or whatever method of content, getting your voice out there, learning your voice, learning your thought leadership. Who makes you different than anyone else in your space? What makes your thoughts different than every other speaker in the motivational speaker space or the data driven speaker space? And really leaning into what makes you you, your stories, and your expertise, and just if you have any sort of system or framework or you've written a book, but leaning in deep to those things. And really, that's the hard work of speaking. I think a lot of us enjoy the enjoyment of just getting up in front of people and presenting content, but really truly great content is going to come when you've done that hard thought leadership work. And I personally haven't found a shortcut to both doing the thinking work and also just the delivery work of getting lots and lots and lots of reps. I have a lot of people who aspiring speakers reach out who they really want to become professional speakers and they're not there yet. And I tell them on the content perspective, there's just no shortcut. You have to do the work to figure out what you believe about things and lean into the vulnerability of storytelling and all of those pieces. So obviously a lot goes into it, but I would say, I don't think there's a shortcut. Have you found a shortcut? And if so, I mean, you can package it and sell it for millions of dollars, Grant.
Yeah, I wish, because yeah, you're correct that just in general, I think as humans, like we look for that path of least resistance, not necessarily because we're lazy. Oftentimes, we want to be effective and efficient with our time and resources. And so, what is that path of least resistance? And if there is one, that'd be great. But I think you're exactly right that a lot of it just comes with experience, and experience just takes time, and it takes time giving reps and getting those reps, and you're presenting and like, okay, this worked or that didn't work, and why did it work with this audience but it didn't work with that audience? And some of that stuff, again, it takes a lot of time to learn. Now I want to go back to something else that you mentioned before as well about, let's say you're preparing the talk, and you said that some speakers like to manuscript everything out verbatim, word for word. I've done that a lot. And I know also some speakers, like you alluded to, say, I just need a couple of bullet points, I'm gonna hop up there and kind of riff. And I tend to kind of shy away from that. I think oftentimes like it can be a bit lazy and kind of a cop out, where speakers aren't really thinking through it. I'm just going to kind of, hobnob up there and hope it all magically works out, which, most of the time it doesn't. So what's kind of that right balance? Because what you also don't want to do is you don't want to get up there and just riff, but you also don't want to be so formulaic and robotic. And I have to memorize every single word exactly. And it feels regurgitated. So how do you find that right balance between scripting and non-scripting?
So, my recommendation is to fully script out your stories for the first time that you're telling them. Now, what notes you take up and how much you use, that's different. But I encourage on really like new content to consider fully scripting it out, especially stories, because that way with stories you can figure out, okay, when this experience happened, what did I think and what did I feel? What were my five senses doing? You can get all the elements of what makes a great story into it. Where sometimes if we're just like riffing, if you were to ask me like, oh, how'd you meet your spouse? I would just rattle off. And it's not that I wouldn't have a correct answer, but I wouldn't have maybe thought through the dimensions of storytelling. So I often tell clients, hey, consider fully scripting out your stories. Also consider fully scripting out your open and your close. Those are the most memorable parts of any presentation. And you want to make sure that you nail those parts. Obviously, you want all of your content to be great, but you really want to make sure the open is great, because that's when people are making evaluations of you, whether they want to listen to the rest of the content, whether they like you, all of those pieces. And your close is that final impression. So I encourage people to consider fully scripting out stories or their opens and close, and also consider scripting out transitions. And the reason why is from on the delivery standpoint, when you look at speakers that do have a lot of filler words, they are almost always in the transitions. The speaker struggling to know how am I getting from my second to my third point or my fourth point to my close? And so I would say consider scripting out your transitions so that you have something there in your head of how you are getting to those points, and also thinking through that open and close. And then in terms of the rest of the content, I, by nature, am a writer. I tend to more fully write out things. But even, we were talking about the greatest playlist. I share a story about why you should eat potato chips before you speak in one of my presentations. And I have given that story so many times. I just write potato chips because I've already written
Yeah.
it out. I've already practiced it. I already know how to deliver it. But especially on new content, consider fully writing it out.
And so for a speaker who's also thinking about like, yeah, but if I write it out, then I just feel too constricted and yada yada. And again, I think 99% of the time is just a cop out and they just don't want to do the work and the practice there. But let's say hypothetically that they were to script it out and, certain parts of it. When you're thinking about then practicing it, because just because you script it out doesn't necessarily mean like, okay, I got it, let's hop up on stage and do it. There's so much work that happens behind the stage that and behind the scenes for a speaker to feel more confident and prepared. So like, what do you kind of prescribe or recommend for a speaker going like, okay, I've got, kind of a mix of an outline and a mix of a manuscript. And now like, am I trying to memorize this word for word verbatim, like the lyrics of a song or the national anthem, or am I just trying to get the gist of it? And like, what is that practicing? Am I like talking in front of a mirror? Am I pacing back and forth? Am I speaking out loud? Am I just running through this in my head? Like, what does then that process look like?
Well, a few things. One, I would say, and I would love to just add on the things you fully script out, write them out as you talk, not formal writing you. Because we have a tendency when we are scripting things out, we write more formally than we actually speak. In conversation, we say, and you're gonna, we gotta, y'all. But sometimes when we go to write, we write you all. So then, even if you are not taking up a script and you get up there, you're not going to sound authentically like yourself because you haven't actually scripted it the way that you talk. So that's one little note: is make sure you script it as you talk, not as your ideal writing formal self. But once
Good.
you are to the point of, okay, you've worked really hard, you've developed out this keynote, how are you actually learning the content to take on your presentation? A few things I recommend. One, I think it's one of the most underrated tool on every single iPhone is the voice memos app. I don't know, Grant, if you've ever used this, but I think that when you have your computer, you have your notes, you have your slide deck, you have everything with you, record yourself giving it exactly how you would like to give it. And you'll be amazed at how much more time you have to learn the content later on when you can just listen to yourself. You're driving your kids to soccer, you're mowing the lawn, you're doing dishes, whatever, you're going on a run, whatever your normal life routine looks like. You'll be amazed at how much more time you have to work on your content when you can listen to yourself giving it back. It's going to be painful. We all hate the sound of our own voice, but once you get over that, it can be such a great tool for learning your content. Another of, I'm sure you're this way as well. I've had so many clients and people share crazy ways they've learned their content. There's this Sherlock Holmes memory palace technique that a couple of my clients swear by. I don't
What's
know if you've
that? I've
heard of
never
this
heard of
one,
this.
Grant.
Huh?
So it basically is like how Sherlock Holmes solved mysteries. So if you go to YouTube and just type in Sherlock Holmes Memory Palace, it's this wonky way of you associate every single piece of your speech with an area that's familiar to you. So it's like
Okay.
the coat is your open and you toss the coat on this, and then the cup in your house. It sounds wonky. Some people love it.
Yeah.
I have some clients that even create acronyms in their content, to learn it. Some of my clients who are more visual learners, they just put 6 different color sticky notes on their board they take a picture of, and they just look at that to remember. My biggest piece of advice though is your goal is to internalize your content for the big ideas, not to memorize it. So you're going to have gone over it enough where it's very internalized for your presentation before you deliver. Obviously, in most situations, you're going to have confidence monitors, you're going to have some level of speaker notes that you can take up minimal notes with you. But I think the biggest piece, if you were going to make one change to your speaking and one change to your practicing, is get in the pattern of practicing your content in front of real people for feedback prior to delivering it on a stage. And by real people, I don't mean your spouse. I've been married 14 years, and I always say your spouse is not the best person to run your content through, because either they're going to be too honest or not honest enough, depending on how long you've been married. But I also think that your team and those closest to you, they're too close to your content as well, because they know you and they know they were there when the thing happened, or they know what you meant to say, or whatever the scenario is. So if you want to really start leveling up, a week to 2 weeks before you're delivering it on a bigger stage, you're going to run that content through someone else for feedback. Not all practice is created equal. Giving your content to your bathroom mirror on, the Wednesday before the Thursday you speak is not going to be as effective as if the Friday before you'd run it through a group of 3 to 5 people. And I always say how much you practice and who you practice in front of will be determined some by how big the audience is. So obviously, if you're giving a presentation to a virtual audience of 8 to 12, it's going to be a little bit different stakes than if you're giving it to 5,000 at a huge event. So the larger the event, the more time you want to give yourself to have just prepared, practiced, run it through people for feedback so that you can take their feedback and go, okay, this is where you need to level up. Or even just sometimes when we're practicing by ourselves, no one is laughing, the content doesn't expand at time. And so we can get totally off on how long our keynote's running because it's like, well, during my run through, it was 41 minutes, but we weren't thinking through, oh, in a room this size, the laughter is going to hold. Or in a room this size, everything's just going to take a lot longer. And so another reason to practice is it's going to give you a better basis for how long is my content actually running through. So those are a few things that I would suggest. And then a lot of it I do think is just truly knowing your learning style.
Yeah.
So knowing, well, do you do well with things printed out where you're reading and you're highlighting? And for myself on any speech that I'm learning, I have a color coding system. So it's like, well, my humor lines are in red and my slides are in blue and audience participation's in yellow. And so I've even figured out just kind of a color coding system for myself so I can glance down and know where I'm going. But making sure you've taken the time and the effort as a speaker to figure that out for yourself.
No, that's really good. I want to also touch on a topic we've talked about several times on the show here, and that's slides. How do you think about slides? There's pros and cons with them. I typically am not a huge fan of them. I think from a speaker standpoint, or from an audience standpoint, they can be very effective. I think for speakers, they can become like a de facto confidence monitor, and speakers just end up, reading off their slides and spending more emphasis on the slides and the speech itself. And so, like a rule of thumb we've always talked about is that the slides should be the enhancement, not the replacement for your talk. The enhancement, not the replacement. So, how do you think about slides? Should we have slides? Should we not have slides? What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with what you say. I always say it. You are the presentation. People did not come to see a slide deck. If they wanted to see a slide deck, why didn't you just send it an email? So always remembering that you, not your slides, are the presentation. That being said, I do think there's some do's and don'ts when it comes to your slides. In general, I think that slides, as you said, can enhance and drive forward your presentation. But you need to really be strategic with what is going on a slide. In general, what should go on a slide is what moves your speech forward. So a well-placed photo can save you a ton of energy. It can be great humor. Energy meaning you would have to explain the story a lot, where one quick picture, everybody's got it, and it can be a great humor addition. I also think, especially on longer keynotes, let's say you have the 5 points of culture, returning to that if that was your keynote, having some benchmark parts, in there to drive your speech forward. In general, I tend to be a little bit more of a minimalist on slides. I think for an in-person event, one slide every 3 to 5 minutes usually is pretty effective. I think virtual presentations, you might want to consider having a few more. If you're using them, have more of them. But I also think virtual presentations, you might want to consider, if you can, ditching them completely so that you can take up the whole screen. A lot of these platforms, if you're sharing your deck, you become the tiny window, and then it does feel like your deck is the presentation. So I think really thinking through. But one thing I would say, a couple mistakes I see speakers make all the time. One is talking to their slides instead of the audience.
Yep.
So if you are going to have slides, have the confidence and believe that when you fire that slide, it's behind you instead of looking to check or speaking to the slide. An exception would be if you were making fun of something on the slide and sharing a moment with the audience. That would be the only time that I think it can be effective to look at the slide, because you're like, wow, that was me in 8th grade.
Yeah.
And we see why I didn't have boyfriends, or, whatever it is. If you're making fun maybe of yourself or something they're visually seeing, I would say, but that's the rare exception of when you should be looking at the slide. Another is, we all have seen the slide that hangs just a little too long. Maybe it's something a little uncomfortable or a little hard to read, or it's, a GIF that's rotating or doing something wonky. So consider putting in just a couple blank buffer slides in your deck after something like that, if you have something like that, but you don't necessarily need something behind you. And then I always would say, you should ask, do I need slides? Do slides drive my presentation forward? I mean, if you watched any comedian, none of them use slides, and they keep us engaged and riveted the whole time because they know that they are the presentation. And so I would say overall, I'm a fan of slides. I think they can really help messages. Just make sure that you don't fall into some of the pitfalls of talking to them, having typos on your slides, too much content on your slides, going through them too quickly where the audience is absorbing or not even referencing what is on the slide. If you're going to have it on the slide, make it a part of your speech. Don't just throw up a random quote from someone that you haven't even verbally said out loud. Make sure either you're giving the audience time to pause and read the quote themselves, or that you're making it a part of your presentation. But don't just have slides because you're supposed to have slides. Make sure that everyone is intentionally chosen.
1000% agree. Yes. So many speakers are like just so emphasized and focused on the slides. It's like, yeah, but you're doing it at the detriment of the talk. The talk is what you are hired for, not to be a pretty, graphic designer or whatever.
And spread the word. Anyone hearing this, spread the word.
Yes, indeed. We'll start a campaign for this. Okay, let's talk about another thing here. Let's say that you go give the presentation, and what's interesting about speaking, as you well know, is you can give the exact same presentation and to one audience, and it goes great, and you can give it, to a different audience and a different environment, and it's just falls flat for whatever reason, right? So, how much do you think about, and how much of a factor is the audience and the environment itself? So, I'll give you some examples. So, I always like to talk about, like, I remember years ago speaking at an event, and in terms of the environment, and it was in a room that sat like 2,000 people. And so I gave a keynote in that room for 2,000 people. Well, right afterwards, they had me do a workshop in the same room with 50 people. So a room that seats 2,000 people with 2,000 people in it is awesome. But a room that seats 2,000 people with 50 people in it, it eats you alive. And so how do you think about the environment, but then also the audience, meaning like, let's say, right before you get up to speak, the whoever's introducing you, the VP of sales, is like, "Oh, by the way, we're gonna have to make massive cuts, and we're gonna tell you more about that as soon as the speaker's up. Please welcome to the stage." Like, you're walking into, just like, you're set up to fail in that type of situation. Or if you're the last speaker of a several day conference, and everyone's just tired and just fatigued, or if you're right before a meal or something like that. Like, how do you kind of think about, like, the environment and the audience, and how much of a factor that plays into your presentation and your speech?
Well, I love that you shared that experience of the 2000 to the 50 because I recently had an experience like that myself. I was speaking at a conference, and it wasn't actually that poorly attended for the breakout. It was about 25 people, which is pretty average for the breakouts at this conference, but it was in this cavernous room.
Yeah.
And so we did have everybody like, "Hey, please come up to the front." But I would say we've kind of all been there. So a few things I would say is, just as much as you can, do a little of that homework and pre-thought, whether that's the call with the event organizer or just a little digging on your own, or, if you have an admin, somebody digging for you to figure out, like, okay, just flow, like, oh, I'm right after lunch. Well, who's in the morning? Who's after me? What is the overall vibe of the industry? It's like, oh, is it rocking and rolling and their industry's never done better? Or is it like, wow, they're in a really rough season? So as much as you can, get those things figured out prior to going. And even the room that you're in, I always encourage speakers, anytime that you can, go and scope out your room and practice your tech. You're even just going, oh, wow, this room, it's a really awkward layout. Well, can I actually move where I'm presenting from? Or there's a lot of cords on the ground. Wow, they don't seem to have any AV services at
Yeah.
this maybe I'll go get a roll of duct tape to like smack down the cords. But like anytime you can scope out. But sometimes it is, as you said, you're geared up, you're ready to go, you've done all the work, and then the announcement, and there's going to be layoffs, after whoever,
Yeah.
or there is be something, or maybe there's massive construction going on in the building right next door that's very, very loud, or maybe it's paper thin walls at a conference and the breakout next to you is very, very loud, playing loud music, or there's always going to be those things. So I think it can be very helpful to just be nimble and kind of have an attitude of flexibility, as well as having a few planned pocket jokes. And so these are going to be jokes or comments that you're going to pull out if something goes wrong, maybe not on the layoffs, but technology. Like,
Yeah.
there's probably a pretty good chance as a speaker that you are going to have the scenario, you get to the venue and the technology's not great, or your video doesn't fire, the audio doesn't play, the slide doesn't advance. There's going to be a tech challenge. So if you can have a pre-planned joke and just kind of a self-awareness, it can go a long way as a speaker. So even something as simple as, wow, I guess my technology, like my teenagers, is not going to listen to me today. Like it just shows a self awareness. It's not like rip roaring funny, but it just shows a lightness and a levity that you can have towards it. So I'd say as much as you can prepare, and then also just have a few of those pre-planned, like your text probably going to go out, or how do you recover from a bad introduction? So I think we've all heard or received one of those introductions that's, oh, and this person needs no introduction. And you're like, well, actually they do. Like I wish you'd put a little more work into that.
Please
But
read the
knowing,
sheet I
well,
gave you. Yes.
yeah. But knowing like, okay, with after I've given a really gripping, compelling open and won my audience over, where is a spot that I could, sub in a little bit more about my bio or a little bit more about who I am because I wasn't given an intro. So kind of having that nimbleness and that flexibility of predicting common challenges of, wow, poor intro, bad tech, the speaker ran over my time by 15 minutes and now the event organizer right beforehand told me I need to be 10 minutes shorter. Whatever the scenario is, just kind of having that nimbleness and anticipate problems because they are going to come to you as a speaker. And the more that you can have a good sense of humor and a self-awareness and roll with things, the more enjoyable you'll be for the audience and you'll have a better time yourself.
Well, and a lot of that also ties into what you touched on earlier, that it just comes with reps and it comes with practice. We've all had those like weird situations and scenarios that happen where, like you said, it's loud, a cell phone goes off, someone sneezes real loud, or something weird takes place in the room, and you're just trying to determine in the moment, like, do I say something? Do I not say something? How big of an elephant in the room is this, and how much of a distraction? And how do I address it? How do I, not embarrass or belittle someone in the audience, but call out something that's happened or happening? And just a lot of that again comes with that practice and those reps. Okay, let's wrap up with this. I think that there are times that you see a speaker and as an audience member, and you're like, they did a good job. That was a solid presentation. And then there's times where you see a speaker and you're like, that was amazing. That was really, really impressive in what they did there. And oftentimes it can, like, we can recognize it, but it can be a little bit difficult to like really put our finger on, like, why was that one's so much better than this one. And like, what are the things that you feel like really separates great speakers and great speeches from those that are like, they're good, but they're not like life-changing and as memorable as others?
I believe what separates a great speaker from a good speaker is almost always stories, of really pulling us into a story. And a lot of us think that we're giving stories, but we've actually just given a linear list of facts. A happened, and then B happened, and then C happened. But a truly great speaker invites us into the story. They share the universal truth. So even if their story is really dramatic of something that happened to them that we on paper wouldn't be able to relate to. Maybe they had cancer, or maybe they lost a child, or maybe they had this big, dramatic thing happen to them at work. The great speakers are able to pull the universal truth out of their stories and relate it back to us, the audience. So I always say, if you want to start really leveling up your speaking career, if you want to make that jump from good to great, work on your storytelling, spend more time entering deeply into your stories, because storytelling is such an art form. It's hard. It's hard to be a good storyteller. We have so many details and so many things happen, and even where do you start your story? And especially for those who have really, really big, significant life stories, it can even feel overwhelming. But if you can really spend focused times leveling up your storytelling, I can promise that's going to really begin to take you from being that good to that great speaker.
Yeah, very well said. Eva, this has been phenomenally helpful, and we really appreciate the time. If people want to find out more about you, maybe inquire about the coaching services that you offer, where can we find you?
Yeah, well, I am at thespeakshop.com. I have a lead magnet. Can I start over there?
Yeah,
Sorry.
totally.
You can find me at thespeakshop.com. I have a free resource there, 12 questions you must ask for a killer speech, which will kind of serve it hopefully as your checklist that you can use next time you're preparing a speech. And then I'm very active on LinkedIn. I recently told my mom, I was like, Mom, I'm basically a LinkedIn influencer now. And she goes, well, that's nice, sweetie. I just planted some tomatoes. And I was like, okay, mom's keeping it real every day. But I do post a lot of content on LinkedIn, and I try to really just post a lot of helpful tips to help you grow as a speaker, both on your content development side and your delivery. So find me there as well.
Awesome. Eva, thanks for the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.